Darnell Whitmore didn't look like a CEO that morning. He wore a soft, well-worn leather jacket he'd owned for over a decade, the kind that had seen more airports than most pilots. His jeans were faded at the knees, his sneakers scuffed from too many early flights and late-night walks through terminals. There was no designer luggage, no gold watch, no entourage, just a man with a carry-on, a coffee from the airport kiosk, and a first-class ticket tucked neatly in his wallet. He hadn't planned to fly that day. But after weeks of troubling reports, customer complaints slipping through the cracks, frontline staff sounding exhausted on internal calls, whispers from regional managers about culture slipping, he knew he had to see it for himself. Not from a boardroom, not through spreadsheets, but from the ground. So he booked a seat under his real name, no fanfare, no warning. Just him, blending in like any other traveler. The airport was its usual mix of chaos and calm. Families huddled near gates, business people tapped furiously on laptops, and tired eyes stared blankly at departure boards. Darnell moved through it all like a shadow. He'd done this before, years ago, early in his tenure, but never at one of Horizon Sky's own hubs. This was personal. Horizon wasn't just a company to him. It was something he'd helped rebuild from near bankruptcy. He remembered sleeping on couches in the operations center during storms, shaking hands with baggage handlers after tough winters, and promising every new hire that dignity and respect weren't perks. They were the foundation. Now, standing in line at gate B12, he watched how his people treated others. The gate agents wore crisp uniforms, name tags polished, smiles practiced, but something felt off. Their eyes darted past passengers, scanning for status symbols, a luxury handbag, a tailored suit, the glint of a platinum credit card. Those who matched got warm greetings and priority boarding. The rest, a nod, if that. When it was his turn, he stepped forward calmly. The agent, a young woman with perfectly coiffed hair and a tight smile, barely looked up from her screen. She glanced at his clothes, then at his face, then back to her monitor without asking for his ticket. "Economy group hasn't been called yet," she said, already turning to the next person. "You'll need to wait outside." Darnell paused. Not out of anger, but surprise. He hadn't expected recognition, he didn't want it, but he hadn't expected dismissal either. He opened his mouth to speak, then stopped. This was exactly why he was here. So instead of showing his ticket or stating his title, he simply nodded and stepped aside, leaning against a nearby pillar with his coffee. From there, he watched. A woman in a floral dress and worn sandals approached the counter, clutching a boarding pass with white knuckles. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I think I'm in the right line?" The agent sighed, took the pass without touching the woman's hand, and scanned it like it might be counterfeit. "Stand over there," she said, pointing to a taped-off area near the wall. No explanation. No thank you. Just direction. Minutes later, an older man in work boots and a flannel shirt shuffled up, his carry-on held together with duct tape. He smiled politely. "Morning," he offered. The agent didn't respond. She typed something, then said flatly, "You're not on the upgrade list. Board with Group 3. The man nodded, unfazed. But Darnell saw the slight slump in his shoulders as he walked away. Then came a couple, clearly tourists, speaking in quiet Spanish, holding hands and looking around nervously. They waited patiently, but no one acknowledged them. 5 minutes passed. 10. Other passengers were waved through, but the couple stood there, unsure if they'd done something wrong. Finally, a different agent noticed and waved them forward with a flick of her wrist as if shooing a fly. Darnell sipped his coffee. It had gone cold. He thought about the values painted on the walls of Horizon's headquarters. Every passenger, every time. Service without assumption. Respect is non-negotiable. He'd helped write those. And yet here, in one of their busiest terminals, those words might as well have been graffiti. What hurt most wasn't the rudeness. It was the pattern. It wasn't one bad apple. It was a system that rewarded speed over kindness, appearance over humanity. And he knew deep down that leadership had let this happen, maybe by pushing too hard for revenue, maybe by ignoring the quiet erosion of morale. Whatever the reason, the result was clear. People were being sorted not by their ticket but by how they looked. He checked his watch. Boarding would start soon. He could step forward now, reveal himself, demand answers. But that wouldn't show him the truth. It would only show him panic. So he waited. Let them see him as just another passenger. Let them treat him like one. When the first-class boarding announcement finally came over the speaker, a ripple of movement went through the waiting area. Well-dressed men straightened their ties. Women adjusted designer sunglasses. Darnell stayed where he was, watching to see if anyone would notice he hadn't moved. No one did. The gate agent called, "First-class passengers, please come forward." She looked around, scanning the crowd. Her eyes passed over Darnell twice before landing on a man in a sharp navy suit. "Sir, you're with us?" she asked brightly. The man nodded and stepped up. Darnell followed. The agent turned, surprised. "You're not—" she began, then stopped herself. "Do you have a first-class ticket?" He reached into his wallet and handed it over without a word. She scanned it. Her eyes widened slightly. Then she checked his name against the manifest. Her fingers froze. She looked up at him, really looked this time, into his eyes, not his clothes. Something shifted in her expression. Confusion, then dawning horror. But Darnell didn't give her time to react. He simply said, "I'd like to board now," in the same calm tone he'd used all morning. She stammered an apology, fumbled with his boarding pass, and gestured toward the jet bridge like he was royalty. But he didn't walk ahead. He waited for the older man in flannel, the woman in the floral dress, the Spanish-speaking couple. He made sure they heard their group called. He made sure they weren't left behind. As he stepped onto the plane, he didn't look back. But he carried everything with him. The cold coffee, the duct-taped suitcase, the silence that spoke louder than any complaint. And in that moment, he knew this flight wouldn't end when the wheels touched down. It was just the beginning. The plane hadn't even left the gate, but Darnell already felt heavier than when he'd boarded. He sat by the window, not because he wanted the view, but because it gave him space to think without being watched. Around him, first-class passengers settled in, some flipping through magazines, others adjusting noise-canceling headphones, a few already dozing off. Everything looked smooth, polished, exactly how Horizon Skies wanted the world to see it. But Darnell wasn't seeing the surface anymore. He was seeing what lived underneath. As the flight attendants went through their pre-flight routine, checking seatbelts, offering drinks, smiling with practiced ease, he watched how they moved. Their tone was warm, their gestures graceful. But something still felt rehearsed, like kindness had been turned into a script. He remembered a time when crew members would remember regulars' coffee orders, ask about kids' soccer games, or notice when someone looked nervous about flying. Now it felt like service had been streamlined into efficiency, and in the process something human had been lost. Still, he didn't say a word. Not yet. He sipped water when offered, nodded politely, kept his thoughts tucked away. This wasn't just about one gate agent or one airport. If what he'd seen was happening here in first class, then it was probably worse elsewhere. And he needed to be sure. When the plane finally taxied down the runway and lifted into the sky, Darnell closed his eyes. Not to sleep, but to replay the morning. The woman in the floral dress, the man with the duct-taped bag, the couple who stood silently, afraid to ask for help. He'd seen that kind of hesitation before years ago, when he'd first started in the industry. Back then, he'd been the one told to wait over there while others were ushered through. He'd never forgotten how it felt, like you were invisible unless you looked a certain way. Now he ran a company, and somehow that same feeling was still alive in his own halls. The flight was short, just under 2 hours, and when they landed, Darnell didn't rush off like the others. He waited until the cabin emptied, then stood slowly, stretching his shoulders. He walked through the jet bridge with his carry-on, scanning the terminal ahead. This was a different airport, smaller, less crowded, but still part of Horizon's network. He wanted to see if the pattern held. At baggage claim, he lingered near a family struggling with strollers and suitcases. A Horizon employee in a bright vest stood nearby, chatting on a headset. He never offered help, not even a glance. At the customer service desk, a young man with tired eyes tried to rebook a missed connection. The agent behind the counter typed slowly, sighing every few seconds as if the request was a personal inconvenience. When the young man asked if there were any earlier flights, the agent said flatly, "Not unless you've got elite status." Darnell's jaw tightened, but he kept walking. He found a quiet cafe near Gate C7 and ordered black coffee. As he sat at a small table by the window, he pulled out a small notebook, something he always carried, and began writing. Not emails, not reports, just observations, phrases like ignored unless dressed well, tone changes based on appearance, no eye contact with economy passengers. It wasn't data. It was truth. A flight attendant from his earlier flight walked by, still in uniform, heading toward crew transport. She spotted him, did a double take, then quickly looked away. He didn't call out, but he noted that too, the flicker of recognition, then avoidance. That told him something. People knew the culture was off. They just didn't think anyone in charge cared enough to notice. Later that afternoon, he took a shuttle to another terminal, this one handling mostly regional flights. Fewer luxury shops, more fast food, more families traveling with kids in backpacks. Here, the Horizon staff looked tired. Not just busy, tired in the way that comes from feeling unseen themselves. One gate agent rubbed her temples between announcements. Another yawned openly, not bothering to cover his mouth. Darnell stood in line behind a woman holding a baby and dragging a suitcase with a broken wheel. When she reached the counter, she asked softly if there was any chance of a seat near the front, just so she could get off quickly to catch a connecting bus. The agent barely looked up. "All seats are assigned," he said. "He'll have to manage." The woman nodded, shoulders slumping, and stepped aside. Darnell stepped forward. "I'm flying standby," he said calmly. "Any chance of an upgrade?" The agent finally looked at him, really looked. Took in his plain clothes, his calm demeanor, the lack of luggage tags or status pins. He smirked slightly. "Standby on this route? Good luck, we're full, and upgrades go to Diamond members only." Darnell didn't argue. He just said understood and walked away, but inside something had shifted. This wasn't just poor service. It was a system that had learned to value people based on what they appeared to be worth, not who they were. And that wasn't just bad business. It was a betrayal of everything Horizon had promised to be. As evening fell, he checked into a modest hotel near the airport. Not the corporate partner with the fancy lounge, but a simple place with clean rooms and a flickering lobby light. He ordered room service, ate at the small desk by the window, and called no one. He needed silence to process. He thought about the employees too. Many of them were probably doing their best with little support, unclear guidance, or pressure to hit sales targets, like pushing credit cards or premium seats, instead of focusing on care. He'd seen those internal memos. Increase ancillary revenue per passenger. Maximize upgrade conversions. Somewhere along the line, the mission had drifted from serve people to extract value, and the people who suffered most? Those who couldn't afford to buy their way into kindness. He remembered a conversation years ago with a veteran gate supervisor who'd told him, "Sir, if you treat someone like they don't matter, they'll believe it, and so will everyone watching." At the time, it had stuck with him. Now it haunted him. By midnight, he was still awake. Not pacing, not angry, just deeply sad. Because he knew what came next wouldn't be easy. Fixing this wouldn't be about a memo or a training video. It would mean confronting a culture that had grown comfortable with inequality. It would mean holding people accountable, even good people who'd just gone along with the flow. And it might mean letting go of those who couldn't or wouldn't change. But more than that, it would mean listening. To the passengers who'd been made to feel small. To the staff who'd been pushed to prioritize profit over people. To the quiet voices that had been drowned out by the noise of performance metrics. He turned off the lamp and lay in the dark. Outside, a plane roared down the runway, lights cutting through the night. Somewhere on board, someone might be clutching a worn boarding pass, hoping to be seen. And Darnell made a silent promise: this ends now. Not with a speech. Not with a show, but with action, clear, firm, and fair. Because respect shouldn't be a privilege. It should be the starting point, and tomorrow he'd begin. The next morning, Darnell returned to the same regional airport, not in disguise, but not in full executive armor either. He wore the same leather jacket, the same jeans, but this time he carried himself differently, not as a passenger trying to disappear, but as someone who finally knew what he was looking for. He didn't go straight to the gate. Instead, he walked the concourse slowly, watching how people moved, how staff interacted, how the rhythm of the place felt when you weren't rushing to catch a flight. By 8 a.m., he was back at gate B12, the same spot where he'd been told to wait outside. The same team was on shift. The same energy hung in the air, hurried, distracted, a little brittle. He stood near a charging station, pretending to check his phone, but really watching. A mother with 2 toddlers approached the counter, asking if there was space for a stroller in the overhead bin. The agent barely glanced up. "Gate check only," she said, already turning to her screen. No smile, no offer to help carry it. The woman nodded quietly and walked away, wrestling the stroller herself. Then came an older man in a veteran's cap, moving slowly with a cane. He asked if there was wheelchair assistance available. The response, "You should have requested that when you booked." As if it were a luxury, not a basic need. Darnell's chest tightened, but he stayed still. He wanted to see if anyone would notice him this time. Would recognition come, or would he still be invisible unless he announced himself? It didn't take long. As he stepped closer to the counter just to observe the boarding process up close, a voice behind him said, "Sir." Wait, he turned. It was a ramp attendant, mid-50s, face weathered from years on the tarmac, uniform slightly faded but clean. The man's eyes were wide, his hands fidgeting with his radio strap. He didn't say anything else at first, just stared, like he was trying to convince himself it was really him. Darnell gave a small nod. No words, just acknowledgement. The attendant swallowed hard, then leaned in slightly. I saw you on the safety drill video last year. At headquarters. You spoke about treating every bag like it belongs to your mother." His voice was low, almost reverent. Darnell remembered that day. He'd stood in a hangar full of ground crew, not in a suit but in a Horizon windbreaker, talking about dignity in every role. "Yes," he said quietly. "That was me." The man's face went pale. He glanced toward the gate counter, then back at Darnell. They didn't know," he stammered. "Nobody knew you were—" "It's okay," Darnell said gently. "I needed to see, but the damage was done." The attendant, torn between loyalty and panic, excused himself and hurried toward the station manager's office. Within minutes, a woman in a crisp blazer emerged, regional operations lead, badge gleaming, hair perfectly pinned. Her eyes locked onto Darnell instantly. She froze for half a second, then rushed over, hand outstretched. "Sir, we had no idea you were traveling today," she began, voice tight with nerves. Darnell didn't take her hand. Not out of coldness, but because he didn't want this to become a performance. "I know," he said. That was the point. She blinked, thrown off. Most executives would have demanded a private lounge, a car, an apology parade. But he just stood there, calm, eyes scanning the gate area like he was still taking notes. "Can we speak somewhere private?" she asked, glancing around as if worried someone might overhear. "Not yet," he said. "First, I need the full shift roster for this gate. Everyone who's worked here in the last 48 hours. And I'd like access to the security footage from yesterday morning, starting at 6 a.m. Her face fell. This wasn't a courtesy visit. This was an inspection. She nodded quickly. "Of course." Right away, but Darnell wasn't done. "And before we go inside," he added, "I'd like to speak with each of the frontline staff individually. One by one here now." She hesitated. "Sir, with all due respect, that might disrupt operations." "Then we'll make time," he said, not unkindly. "Because what happened here wasn't just a mistake. It was a pattern. And patterns don't fix themselves." She led him to a small office near the jet bridge, a cramped space with a folding table, a coffee-stained chair, and a whiteboard covered in flight codes. As she pulled up the roster on her laptop, Darnell sat quietly, hands folded. He wasn't here to shame. He was here to understand. One by one, staff members were called in. Not dragged, not scolded on arrival, just asked to step in for a quick chat. The first was the gate agent who'd told him to wait outside. She walked in with her head down, arms crossed. But when Darnell asked, "What do you think good service looks like?" she paused, then quietly, "Making people feel welcome, no matter who they are." "Then why didn't you do that yesterday?" he asked, not accusing, just curious. She looked at the floor. "We've been told, if someone doesn't look like they belong in first class, double-check their ticket. Last month, 2 people tried to sneak in with fake upgrades. So now, as we assume," he repeated. "And what happens when you assume wrong?" She didn't answer, but her eyes said everything. The next was the agent who'd ignored the Spanish-speaking couple. When asked why, he admitted, "I don't speak Spanish. I didn't know what to do, so I waited for someone who did." But no one came. Darnell nodded. So instead of saying 1 moment, please, you said nothing. And they stood there confused. The man's shoulders slumped. Yeah. Another employee, a young man who'd been handling boarding passes, confessed they were under pressure to upsell credit cards during check-in. If we don't hit our weekly target, our supervisor says we're not team players. He looked ashamed. Sometimes, I rush people through so I can get to the next one who might sign up. Darnell listened to each story without interrupting. No yelling, no threats, just questions. What do you need to do your job well? What gets in your way? When did you last feel proud to wear this uniform? Their answers painted a picture. Understaffed shifts, unclear guidance, rewards tied to sales, not service. They weren't bad people, but they'd been put in a system that quietly encouraged them to judge, to prioritize, to cut corners. After the last interview, Darnell sat alone in the office for a long time. Outside, planes taxied, announcements echoed, life moved on. But inside, something had shifted. He called the regional lead back in. I'm not going to fire everyone on the spot, he said. But I can't let this continue. What happened here, turning service into a test of appearance, isn't just poor judgment. It's a violation of our core promise, she nodded, eyes glistening. I know. I've seen it too, I just didn't know how to stop it. Now you do, he said. Effective immediately, this gate team is relieved of duty. Not as punishment, but because trust has been broken. We'll reassign them after retraining. But leadership here? That's on you and me. She took a shaky breath. What happens next? We rebuild, he said, starting with honesty. He stood, picked up his carry-on and walked out, not toward a car or a VIP lounge, but back to the gate area. He made sure the veteran got his wheelchair. He watched as a new supervisor, brought in from another station, greeted passengers by name, offered help without being asked, smiled with his eyes, not just his teeth. And as Darnell boarded his return flight, he knew the hardest part wasn't over. It was just beginning, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like Horizon Skies might remember who it was supposed to serve. Back at headquarters, the air felt different. Not colder, not louder, just heavier, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Darnell didn't go straight to his office. He walked through the main floor, past rows of desks where people typed, chatted, scrolled through emails. Some recognized him and sat up straighter. Others didn't look up at all. He liked that. It meant they were focused not on titles but on work, but he wasn't here to be seen. He was here to act. In the days since the airport visit, he'd reviewed every piece of footage from Gate B12, not just the moment he was turned away, but hours before and after. He watched how staff spoke to passengers in business attire versus those in hoodies or worn shoes. He saw the subtle shifts, the quicker responses, the warmer tone, the extra effort, reserved only for those who looked like they mattered. It wasn't always loud or cruel. Often it was quiet, a glance away, a delayed reply, a sigh no one else noticed. But those small things added up, and over time they told a story. You don't belong here unless you prove you're worth it. That wasn't just bad service. It was a betrayal of trust. He called a meeting. Not with executives first, but with the people who actually shaped daily operations, shift supervisors, training leads, frontline support managers. No PowerPoint, no corporate jargon, just a circle of chairs in a quiet conference room and a simple question. When did we start believing that kindness should come with conditions? Silence at first, then slowly voices emerged. One supervisor admitted they'd been told to focus energy on high-value customers, because they're the ones who keep us profitable. Another said new hires were subtly coached to read the room and prioritize accordingly. A training coordinator confessed the onboarding videos hadn't been updated in 3 years, and the current script still said things like, offer premium or assistance to guests who appear affluent. Darnell listened, really listened, not to assign blame, but to trace the roots. Because the truth was, no one had woken up that morning and decided to be unkind. They'd been shaped by systems, by incentives, by pressure, by silence from the top. And he was part of that silence. He'd been so focused on balance sheets and expansion plans that he'd missed the slow leak in their culture. Now, it was gushing. Later that afternoon, he met with HR and legal, not to build a case for punishment, but to design something better. He made it clear. This wasn't about firing people to make a point. It was about resetting expectations. Anyone who'd acted in clear violation of company values, like refusing service based on appearance, would be let go. But those who'd simply followed flawed guidance, they'd get a chance to learn, to grow, to recommit. The hardest call came that evening. He sat at his desk, the airport roster in front of him, names highlighted in yellow. He knew each one had a life, a family, bills, dreams. But he also knew that if Horizon Skies wanted to mean something to the people who flew with them, it had to mean something to the people who worked for it too. And that meant drawing a line. He picked up the phone. Not to deliver verdicts, but to speak directly to the station manager from Gate B12. "I'm not calling to yell," he said when she answered, voice trembling. "I'm calling because I need you to understand why this hurts." She listened as he described the woman with the floral dress, the veteran with the cane, the couple who stood in silence. "You didn't just fail them," he said gently. "You failed everyone who believed this airline was different." There was a long pause. Then quietly, "I didn't realize it had gotten this bad." "That's the problem," he replied. "None of us did until it was too obvious to ignore." The next morning, official notices went out. The entire frontline team at that gate, along with their direct supervisors, were placed on administrative leave pending a full review. Not fired outright, not dragged through the mud, but removed from customer-facing roles while the company restructured its approach. It was firm but fair, and it sent a message. Values aren't optional. But Darnell knew that removing people wasn't enough. You can't fix a broken culture by just clearing the room. You have to rebuild the foundation. So he did something unusual. He invited a group of recent passengers, ordinary travelers, not VIPs, to headquarters. People who'd flown economy, who'd been ignored, who'd written complaints that were never answered. He sat with them in a sunlit room, served coffee from the same kiosk brand they'd see at the airport, and simply asked, "What do you wish we'd known?" One woman talked about traveling with her autistic son and being told to control him when he got overwhelmed. A college student described being questioned 3 times about his student discount, as if he were trying to scam the system. An elderly man shared how he'd missed a funeral because no one helped him navigate a gate change. Darnell took notes. Not for a report, for himself. Then he turned to his leadership team and said, "From now on, every executive flies undercover once a quarter. Not as observers, but as participants. You check in your own bags. You wait in your own lines. You feel what our passengers feel." He also announced a complete overhaul of training. No more scripts about reading affluence. Instead, modules on active listening, cultural humility, and de-escalation. Role-playing scenarios based on real passenger stories. And most importantly, a new rule. Every employee, from baggage handlers to gate agents, would have the authority to solve a passenger's problem on the spot, without needing manager approval. Because real service isn't about following rules. It's about seeing people. By the end of the week, a draft of a new internal pledge was circulating. "I will not judge your ticket by your shoes. I will not assume your needs. I will treat you like someone I'd want my own family to meet, because you are." It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And as Darnell walked out of the building that Friday evening, he didn't feel victorious. He felt responsible. Because accountability wasn't a one-time event. It was a daily choice to look, to listen, to care, even when no one's watching, especially when no one's watching. A month later, Darnell stood at the same gate where it all began. Gate B12. But this time, everything felt different. The air wasn't tense. The voices weren't sharp. There was a quiet hum of calm, like a room that had finally exhaled after holding its breath too long. New staff moved with purpose, not panic. They greeted passengers by name when they could, made eye contact even when they couldn't, and offered help before it was asked for. No one was standing off to the side looking lost. No one was being sized up before being spoken to. He wasn't here in disguise this time. He wore the same leather jacket, but now people knew who he was. And instead of bowing or scrambling, they simply nodded, like he was one of them, because in a way he was. He'd spent the last few weeks not in boardrooms but in terminals, in training sessions, in late-night calls with frontline teams. He'd listened more than he'd spoken. And slowly something had begun to shift. The changes weren't flashy. There were no press releases shouting about a new era, no viral videos of dramatic firings or tearful apologies. Horizon Skies didn't need that. What it needed, and what it was finally building, was something quieter, deeper: trust. One of the first things Darnell had done was bring back the service without assumption pledge, not as a poster on a wall, but as a living promise. Every new hire now recited it during orientation, not like a chant but like a commitment. And every quarter, teams gathered not to review sales numbers, but to share stories. A passenger who cried when someone helped carry their groceries on board, a child who smiled for the first time all day because a flight attendant drew them a little airplane, an elderly woman who said, "You treated me like I mattered." Those stories were now pinned on bulletin boards, shared in team huddles, even read aloud in leadership meetings, because Darnell believed that if you want people to act human, you have to remind them, daily, that they're serving humans. He also made sure accountability went both ways. Supervisors who pressured staff to push credit cards over care were reassigned. Training materials were rewritten by a team that included gate agents, baggage handlers, and customer service reps, not just corporate consultants. And for the first time, frontline employees had a direct line to share concerns without fear of being labeled complainers. It wasn't perfect. Mistakes still happened. But now when they did, people owned them, learned from them, and tried again. Passengers noticed. Not all at once, but steadily. A frequent flyer wrote in saying, "I've flown with you for 10 years, but this week was the first time I felt truly seen." Another said, "My son has Down syndrome. Last time we were rushed and ignored. This time your team asked how they could help, and meant it." Those notes didn't go into a corporate archive. Darnell read each one aloud in staff meetings. He wanted everyone to know their work wasn't invisible. That a kind word, a patient ear, a moment of dignity, those things mattered more than any upsell. One afternoon, he returned to the small regional airport where the veteran had been turned away. This time, he watched from a distance as a new gate agent spotted an older man struggling with a cane and immediately stepped out from behind the counter. "Let me walk you to the plane, sir," she said, offering her arm. The man smiled, relieved. No questions, no hesitation. Just help. Darnell didn't intervene. He just watched, heart full. Later, he sat with the new station lead, a woman who'd worked her way up from baggage claim, and asked, "What's different now?" She thought for a moment. "We're not scared anymore," she said. "Before, we were afraid of missing targets, of looking soft, of getting in trouble for wasting time on someone who wasn't spending money. Now, we're told that time spent caring is the job, not extra, not optional. The job. That was the core of it, somewhere along the way. The airline had confused efficiency with humanity, but you can't automate kindness. You can't algorithm your way into making someone feel welcome. It has to come from real people making real choices every single day." Darnell knew the road ahead wouldn't be smooth. Old habits die hard. Corporate pressures would always whisper about margins and metrics. But he'd drawn a line and he'd stand by it. Because a company's values aren't tested when things are easy. They're tested when no one's watching, when it's inconvenient, when the smart business move clashes with the right human one. And Horizon Skies had chosen, finally, to be human first. A few weeks after the changes took root, Darnell received a handwritten letter. It was from the woman in the floral dress, the one who'd been told to stand over there. She wrote that she'd almost stopped flying altogether after years of feeling like an inconvenience. But on her most recent trip, a Horizon agent had noticed her nervous glances, walked her to her gate, and even waited with her until boarding began. "You gave me back my dignity," she wrote. "Thank you for remembering that we're all just people trying to get somewhere." He kept that letter in his desk drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. One evening, as he walked through the main terminal after a long day, a young boy, maybe 6 or 7, ran up to him holding a crumpled piece of paper. "Are you the boss?" he asked, eyes wide. Darnell crouched down. "I help run the airline, yes." The boy thrust the paper forward. It was a drawing, a plane, a smiling pilot, and a man in a leather jacket standing beside a gate agent, both holding hands with passengers. At the top, in wobbly letters, it said, "Thank you for being nice." Darnell's throat tightened. He took the drawing gently. "Did you make this?" The boy nodded. "My mom said you fix things." He didn't know how to respond. So he just said, "We're trying," and that was the truth. They weren't heroes. They weren't perfect. But they were trying to do better, to see clearer, to treat every person like they belonged no matter what they wore or how much they spent. As the sun set outside the terminal windows, casting long golden streaks across the polished floor, Darnell folded the drawing carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Then he walked toward the next gate, not as a CEO, but as someone who finally understood. Leadership isn't about being in charge. It's about taking care. And that care starts with a simple choice. Every day, every interaction, every person, to see them, truly see them, and say without words, "You matter here." 6 months after that morning at Gate B12, the changes weren't just visible, they were alive. Not in slogans or press releases, but in the small, unscripted moments that used to be rare and were now becoming routine. A gate agent kneeling to tie a child's shoelace before boarding. A ramp worker helping an elderly passenger carry groceries from a connecting bus to the check-in counter. A flight attendant remembering a passenger's name on a second flight, not because it was in a system, but because she'd taken the time to listen the first time. Darnell didn't need to fly undercover anymore. Not because he trusted everything was fixed, he knew culture was never done, but because he could feel the shift in the air. It was in the way staff greeted each other in the hallways, not with forced cheer, but with quiet respect. It was in the way complaints were handled, not as problems to bury, but as signals to learn from. And it was in the letters that kept arriving, not just from frequent flyers, but from people who had almost given up on air travel altogether. One afternoon, he sat in a small community center near a mid-sized airport, not in a suit but in a Horizon Skies polo and jeans, listening to a group of local residents share their experiences. This was part of a new initiative, Your Sky, Your Voice. Every quarter, Horizon hosted open forums in cities they served, not to pitch, but to listen. No cameras, no PR team, just chairs in a circle and honest conversation. A woman spoke about traveling to see her newborn grandchild for the first time. "Last year I got lost in the terminal and no one looked at me twice," she said. "This time a young man saw me looking confused and walked me all the way to my gate. Didn't ask if I was flying first class. Didn't check my ticket. Just saw I needed help and gave it." Another man, a teacher, talked about flying with his students on a field trip. "Before we felt like a burden, like we were slowing things down. But last month, your team printed extra boarding passes when one kid lost his. They even brought snacks to the gate because they heard we hadn't eaten. That's not service. That's care." Darnell didn't speak much during these sessions. He took notes, asked gentle follow-ups, and mostly just absorbed. Because real change didn't come from the top down. It came from paying attention to the ground and letting it shape you. Back at headquarters, the ripple effects were spreading beyond customer service. Employee turnover had dropped by nearly 40% in frontline roles. People were staying, not just for the paycheck, but because they felt proud again. One baggage handler told a trainer, "For the first time in years, I tell my kids, yeah, I work for Horizon, and I don't have to explain why it's not as bad as it sounds." Training sessions had transformed too. Instead of dry lectures on policy, new hires now spent half their orientation shadowing real staff, then role-playing real scenarios. What do you do when a passenger is crying? When someone doesn't speak English? When a child is scared of flying? The answers weren't in a manual. They came from empathy, from practice, from being told, it's okay to be human. And perhaps the most surprising shift was in leadership. Executives who used to measure success only in load factors and revenue per seat were now asking different questions in meetings. Did we make anyone feel unseen this week? Where did we fall short on dignity? Who did we help today, not just serve but truly help? Darnell made sure those questions stayed central. He started every all-hands meeting not with financials but with a story, a real passenger moment, good or hard. Sometimes it was joyful, a proposal on a flight, a reunion at baggage claim. Sometimes it was painful, a missed connection that cost someone a job interview, a language barrier that led to confusion. But every story was treated with equal weight, because each one revealed something about who they were becoming. One day, while walking through a maintenance hangar, he met a technician who'd been with the airline for over 20 years. The man wiped grease from his hands and said, "You know, I used to think my job was just to keep the plane safe, and it is. But now I hear the crews talking about passengers like their neighbors. And I realize my work keeps people safe so they can get to their people. That's different. That matters more." That stuck with Darnell. Because this wasn't just about fixing a gate or retraining staff. It was about reconnecting every role, every person to the human purpose behind the job. A ticket wasn't just a transaction. A flight wasn't just a route. It was a mother getting to her daughter's graduation, a son returning home after years away, a patient traveling for treatment, a dreamer chasing an opportunity, and Horizon Skies had nearly forgotten that. Now they were remembering. But Darnell also knew that culture wasn't a switch you flipped. It was a garden you tended, and weeds could still grow if you weren't careful. So he kept checking, not with audits but with presence. He'd show up unannounced at 5 a.m. shifts, grab coffee with the night crew, sit with interns during lunch. He asked the same question everywhere. What's one thing we could stop doing that gets in your way of being kind? The answers surprised him. Too many forms. Too many pop-up alerts on their screens. Too much pressure to upsell during check-in. So they cut the forms, simplified the software, and quietly retired the credit card pitch from frontline interactions. Not because revenue didn't matter, but because trust mattered more. And trust, once lost, was harder to rebuild than any balance sheet. Passenger satisfaction scores began to climb, not dramatically, but steadily. More telling was the feedback from staff. In anonymous surveys, words like respected, heard, and proud appeared more often than stressed, rushed, or invisible. That was the real metric. Then came the unexpected gift. Other airlines started calling. Not to compete, but to learn. Not because Horizon was the biggest or the richest, but because people were talking, quietly, genuinely, about how it felt to fly with them now. Darnell didn't hoard the lessons. He shared them freely at industry roundtables, not as a boast, but as an invitation. We all serve people. Let's remember that together. One evening, as he waited for a delayed flight, not as CEO, just as a traveler, he watched a new gate agent handle a chaotic situation with calm grace. A storm had grounded several flights. Passengers were frustrated, tired, scared. Instead of hiding behind the counter, the agent stepped out, mic in hand, and spoke plainly. I don't have all the answers yet, but I'm not going anywhere until you're taken care of, and neither is my team. The crowd didn't cheer, but they quieted. Shoulders relaxed. Someone even offered the agent a bottle of water. Darnell smiled to himself. That was the moment he knew it had taken root. Not perfection, but humanity. Not performance, but presence. Later on the plane, a flight attendant recognized him. She didn't fawn or panic. She just leaned in and said, My mom flew with us last week. She said it felt like the old days, the good old days. Thank you for bringing that back. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. Thank you for living it every day. When he got home that night, he found a package on his doorstep. No return address. Inside was a framed photo, taken by a passenger's phone, of him standing at gate B12 6 months earlier, looking out at the terminal, coffee in hand, face unreadable. On the back, in neat handwriting, it said, This is the day you chose people over pride. We noticed. He hung it in his office, not on the wall behind his desk, but on the side where visitors could see it. But he'd have to turn his head to look at it. A quiet reminder. Leadership isn't about being seen. It's about seeing others. Months turned into a year. The story of that morning at the gate faded from headlines, as all stories do. But its echo remained, in the way a child now waved at gate agents like they were friends, in the way staff paused to ask, How's your day really going? In the way no one ever again had to prove they belonged just to be treated with basic decency. Darnell never gave a big speech about it. He didn't need to. The work spoke for itself. And on quiet mornings, when he walked through an airport before sunrise, he'd sometimes stop near a gate, watch the world move, and feel a deep, quiet peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because they were trying, every day, to be worthy of the trust people placed in them when they stepped onto a plane. Because flying isn't just about getting from one place to another. It's about believing, however briefly, that someone out there cares whether you arrive safely, kindly, and seen. And now at last, they did.